As the title suggests, this video is filled with some disturbing stories. Some of them a bit more disturbing than others, one of them having its own content warning in the story, so I'll leave that intact, but just a heads up, these stories may be a bit disturbing for those of you listening. But I hope that you do enjoy. I have a story that is probably one of the most disturbing things to have ever happened to my family. I say my family because it was more so my grandparents, but it's something that has been kind of held close to all of us since it happened. All of this happened on my grandparents' property, and my grandpa was even looked at as a suspect for a moment, but was eventually cleared for the whole thing. Even still, this whole event was devastating for my grandfather, for reasons that will be obvious in a little while. I do need to give a small bit of context, so bear with me while I detail a few things. This happened quite a long time ago. My dad was still in his teens when this took place, so it was way before my time. My grandparents lived in the northwestern part of the US, and they owned a decent amount of land there. It all belonged to my great-great-grandfather, and had been passed down twice at this point to my grandfather, Ronald. On the land that they owned, in the southern corner, complete opposite of my grandparents' actual house, was a small cabin that, way back, was where the hired help on the land lived. By the time my grandfather got the land, the cabin was empty, and was used more for storage than anything. Still, they kept it up, and made sure that if anyone ever wanted or needed to stay in the cabin, they could. My grandfather kept the land around it tidy, and kept it up on the maintenance of the building. It is important to mention that this cabin, being on the opposite end of the property, was nowhere near the house. In order to get to the cabin, you would have to get on the road, circle around the property until you hit the south end, and then pull up the driveway to get to it. In the fall of 1965, my grandfather's cousin, Walter, a man that helped raise my grandfather because they were separated by about 12 years, came to visit my grandpa, and asked him if he could stay in the cabin for a little while. Apparently, Walter had, in his words, fallen on hard times, and needed somewhere to stay for a couple of months. My grandfather didn't ask him any questions about what had happened, because Walter was family, and he said that Walter was welcome to stay for as long as he needed. Obviously, my grandpa was suspicious that something was going on, that Walter had done something illegal or questionable, because he'd been in with some questionable people in the past. But again, he was family, and my grandpa never questioned family or left them in the cold. He was a man that didn't say much, but he was very loyal to those that he knew and loved, because that's how he was raised. A few weeks passed, and Walter had set up his home in the cabin. My grandfather went over to visit with him a few times over the first week to see how he was doing. Walter seemed a bit nervous at first, but as the first month came and went, he seemed a lot more comfortable and less on edge. Again, red flags, I know, but my grandfather was confident that Walter would be able to handle whatever it was. He did ask him if he should be worried for himself and his wife at one point, but Walter told him that everything was fine, and that he would just be there a few months until things settled down, and then he would be out of his hair. Again, questionable comments being made there, but in the end, my grandpa just said that Walter was free to stay as long as he needed, told him where the ammo for the hunting rifle in the cabin was, then went back home to my grandmother and my father. A couple more weeks passed, and my grandpa hadn't heard much from Walter. And that Saturday, he decided he would take the trip around to see how he was, and to ask if he wanted to help with some work that he needed to do. He pulled his truck up to the cabin, and immediately felt like something was off. Walter's car wasn't in the driveway, but the door to the cabin was wide open. My grandpa thought initially that Walter had to take off in a hurry and left the door open. Obviously, this bothered him, but it would have been the better alternative to what did end up happening. My grandpa walked up to the cabin and called out for his cousin, but there was no response. Then he walked in. He knew immediately that something horrible had happened. My grandfather always described what he saw as a scene straight out of his worst nightmares. The furniture in the cabin was overturned and destroyed. One of the windows was shattered, with the glass on the inside of the cabin, meaning it had been broken in, and the air was thick with that coppery scent of blood. There was a massive dark stain on the carpet in the living room, and a trail that led from there out the back door of the cabin, like the person that was bleeding had been dragged out of the cabin. Then he noticed the large, bloody knife that was stabbed into the cabinet, pinning a piece of paper to it. And my grandfather's blood turned cold as ice when he read it. "Sorry about your cabin, Ronald. This wasn't personal, and we have no beef with you. Don't bother trying to find him. We were told to take care of him and to make him disappear. So he did." My grandpa said that those words were like a cold hand around his heart, that they made him feel sick to his stomach when he read them. He panicked and started shouting for Walter, but he knew deep down that there wasn't going to be a response. Whoever Walter had messed with had taken care of business, and that was the end of it. Grandpa raced back home and called the authorities, telling the cops that he thought that someone had been murdered in the cabin. Their investigation ended up yielding more questions than answers. Of course, back then, forensics wasn't exactly a super complex thing. The only clue was the blood, the knife, and the note. And Walter was never found, dead nor alive. A fact that hovered over my grandfather for probably the rest of his life. The cabin was a crime scene for a while, and the officers and investigators coming through every once in a while to try to find clues, or to ask my grandfather questions, but after a little while it was released back to him to do with as he pleased. My grandpa ended up moving all of his tools and everything he needed out of the cabin. It burned everything else in it, and then boarded up the husk that he left behind. He wanted to demolish it, but he never did. I think that it haunted him too much to do so. Like, he wanted to, but then kept telling himself that maybe Walter would come back. The only time that I went out to that side of the property as a kid, my father told me the story of what happened, and I saw that the building had pretty much been destroyed by nature. Overgrown, wood rotting out, and so forth. My uncle ended up taking over the land, as my father had moved out of state, so he offered it to him instead, when both my grandparents had passed away. My uncle did end up demolishing the old cabin, so there's nothing left there now but the memories of what happened. As of today, Walter's case is obviously on ice. No evidence, no new leads, and everyone involved is probably gone by now. But whatever ended up happening to Walter, based on the state of that cabin, I have to imagine that it wasn't quick, nor painless. Hi, Raven. First, I want to thank you for your hard work. I appreciate that you give a voice to so many stories. Thank you. I would like to share a very personal story that took place nearly 4 years ago on Halloween night. During that time, the world was under lockdown due to the pandemic, and Halloween celebrations were non-existent. Only trick-or-treating was permitted. I was feeling depressed and anxious, as I was in my mid-20s and still unsure about my life's direction. That night, I was chatting with a guy I had dated named Leo, who shared many interests with me, such as our love for art and the macabre. Conversations with him were effortless. However, our relationship didn't work out because I had personal issues and saw too much of myself in him, which made me feel vulnerable. I made the difficult decision to end our relationship, which surprised and saddened him, and as a result, we lost contact. On that Halloween night, my roommate was out of town, and I wanted to make the most of the occasion. I suggested to Leo that we take a walk to discuss the brief time we had spent together, now that enough time had passed for us to reflect with a calm mindset. He agreed. And so after meeting at our meeting spot at around 9:30 p.m., we decided to walk through the old part of town where we lived. This area used to be bustling with tourists, restaurants, and bars, even during nighttime. However, on that night, it was eerily empty. We encountered only a few scattered individuals as we strolled along. Both of us were fast walkers, and before we knew it, we found ourselves deep in the old town, near the castle, a prominent symbol of our city. We faced a choice: either retrace our steps and follow the same path back, or continue alongside the castle, walking along the cliff's edge on a narrow boardwalk covered in foliage, eventually leading to a large park. The second option seemed more unsure as it was dark and desolate at that time of night. However, we were so lost in our conversation, and we chose to proceed without even thinking about it. As we ventured down the dimly lit path, unease began to settle in. Since it was Halloween night, I started joking about shadows and sharing spooky stories, as one would do around a bonfire. The path was illuminated by lampposts, and one particular light was flickering, which sent a shiver down my spine. We paused there, and I remarked on how creepy the area felt, like the perfect setting for a scene in a slasher movie. Although we laughed, I couldn't shake off the underlying fear of being alone and far from help. Strangely, despite our brief and complicated dating history, and his affinity for the dark and macabre, I felt safe with Leo. After approximately 10 minutes of walking along the eerie path, we finally reached the park and began making our way back to our meeting point. Along the way, we passed the entrance to the old town, where we noticed police cars entering amid a commotion. Curiosity led us to inquire about the situation with a bystander. He informed us that there was a man roaming around with a knife, scaring people. I felt perplexed, trying to recall if we had encountered anyone suspicious during our walk, but I couldn't remember. Brushing it off as a Halloween prank taken too far by an intoxicated man, I thought nothing more of it. Oh, how mistaken I was. The bystander suggested that we go home and lock ourselves in. I escorted Leo to his place and then hurried back to mine, feeling a sense of unease. It was only upon returning home that the gravity of the situation truly sank in. I came across numerous posts detailing the event that had unfolded, and as I pieced everything together, I began trembling uncontrollably. I realized that choosing the eerie boardwalk may have saved both mine and Leo's lives. And this is what happened. On Halloween night in 2020, around 10:30 p.m., a man dressed in medieval attire carried out a mass stabbing near the provincial legislature, the National Assembly of Quebec, in Quebec City. Armed with a katana-style saber, he randomly attacked innocent people. Tragically, 2 individuals lost their lives, and 5 others were injured. Understanding what happened with the information I had at that time, I couldn't stop shaking. Even now, the memory sends shivers down my spine. A mentally ill man slashing people on the night of Halloween seems like something straight out of a horror movie, but all of it was real. When I pieced back the events of the night, I realized that the attack must have started right behind us, at the foot of the castle, when we decided to walk on the dark path ahead of us. It hit me that if we had chosen to retrace our steps, we would have almost certainly crossed paths with the assailant. It was surreal to think that a seemingly insignificant and eerie decision like walking forward had saved our lives. Furthermore, I discovered that a friend of mine had also been walking alone that very night, not far from us. Unfortunately, he wasn't as lucky as Leo and me. He was attacked and left for dead, barely surviving. As a result of the attack, he still bears scars and lost one of his fingers. However, I am amazed by his resilience, and I can confidently say that he is thriving today. Reflecting on that Halloween night, I realized how unpredictable life can be, and how seemingly inconsequential decisions can have profound impacts. This event truly shook me to the core, serving as a wake-up call. Shortly after, I made the decision to seek the help I needed for my mental health, and it completely transformed my life. As a result of this sequence of events, I discovered my path and purpose. Today, I'm actively involved in the field of mental health, and I see a bright future ahead of me. When I reflect on that fateful night, I'm filled with gratitude for being alive and for choosing to walk on the dark path. It's a reminder that sometimes the safest path may not be the safest at all. Life is unpredictable, and we truly never know what lies ahead. Before I fully tell this story that I want to tell, I would like to get a few things out of the way. The first thing I want to mention is that the story is disturbing, and it should probably have some sort of trigger warning on it, so I do ask that you mention this in your narration. The story does involve child abuse to some extent, specifically an abusive drunk father, and I know that topic could very well be sensitive to a lot of people. The only reason that I've decided to submit this story is because of how disturbing it can be. I know you read stories for people's entertainment, and I fully understand that this submission will be seen as that by a lot of people, but I feel it's important to get this out there. If not for me, then for the person that it happened to. Alright, that out of the way, I also feel that this story needs to be set up a little bit. The story is about a person that I would say was my best friend from the start. His name was Ronnie, and Ronnie lived a few houses down from me, just around the corner, on an intersecting street to the one that I grew up on. We had the same teacher in kindergarten, which is where we met, and we were put in the same class through all of elementary school. Ronnie and I shared everything, from hobbies to secrets. He knew everything about me, all there was to know about a kid that age, I guess, and I knew everything about him. Except there was one thing about him that was always strange to me. When we played, he was always at my house, or another friend's house on the block. I never went to his house. Even when I was that age, I always sensed there was something wrong with that scenario. If one of us mentioned going to his house, he would do a complete 180 and get quiet or try to make an excuse or change the subject. Ronnie was a good kid. He was outgoing and exceptionally bright, which made it strange that he would practically shrink if anyone mentioned his house. In hindsight, his reaction should have been a clue as to what was happening, but as a kid it was just a thing that was weird and mysterious. As we grew up a bit and transitioned into middle school, we stayed good friends, but some of that veil over Ronnie's home life started to lift. Around that time, Ronnie started to be a bit more reclusive, and he would flinch at sudden movements. He would become unnaturally quiet when someone got mad at him for anything. There was one day when one of our teachers in middle school got mad at the class and yelled at us, and he basically went into a panic attack. After class, I was able to catch up with him and talk him down some, trying to figure out what was going on. That was when he told me about his home life. To say that Ronnie's father was strict was an understatement. I would later learn that Ronnie's dad was a towering figure, in both stature and presence, and that he expected Ronnie to be perfect in literally every aspect. Worse yet, Ronnie's father was far from perfect. He was an alcoholic, and when he drank, he would get angry and very aggressive about pretty much everything. When he was a kid, it was just verbal abuse. But as Ronnie hit his early teen years, his father graduated to a more physical approach to parenting. This was why Ronnie was always so involved in class. He was a straight-A student, and he always applied himself 100% in everything he did. However, there were times when this wasn't quite enough for his father, and the threats of the consequences were starting to inch closer and closer to him following through. By the time we reached high school, the pressure on Ronnie had visibly intensified. He was juggling extracurricular activities, was put in the gifted program, and advanced classes because of how well he always did. And by the second quarter of our freshman year, I could see that it was physically taking its toll on him. I know that this was a long setup, but this is actually where everything happened. Our freshman year. Ronnie was in the same biology class as myself. It was the only advanced class that I was ever in, and we had the same period. The teacher, Mr. Henson, had given us a research project that was pretty intense, but it was expected in an advanced class. Part of the project required us to properly cite all of our references in our final printed documentation, and he made it very clear that citations were 50% of the grade. So, if you didn't do it, you would fail the project. Unfortunately, Ronnie apparently stumbled on this project, something that practically never happened. In the whirlwind of everything going on in his life, he had apparently turned in a printed draft of his project, one that didn't have the citations on it, and as such, he got an F. I stuck around after class. It was our last period for the day, and we always went to the bus together, and I witnessed what had happened. He pleaded with Mr. Henson after class, and I could tell that he was on the verge of tears the whole time. He begged him to let him fix it, that he had the final draft and that he had just printed the wrong one. Mr. Henson was, unfortunately, one of those teachers that refused to bend the rules at all. He told Ronnie that it was too late, and that it was just that one report, that it wasn't the end of the world. I heard Ronnie tell him in no uncertain words that his father was going to kill him. Mr. Henson shrugged it off and said that he was sure his father would understand, that accidents happen, and that he would just have to do better in the future. We walked to the bus after that, and I could tell that the fear in Ronnie's eyes was very real. I think that was really the first time that the burden that he carried was truly visible. I knew things were hard, but I don't think it actually hit me how bad it was or could be for him until that moment. I offered to come over and explain that the teacher was a jerk to his dad. I know that it wouldn't have helped, but I was trying to think of anything that would give him a fighting chance. I told him to just come over to my place, and that we would talk to my parents and figure something out. But Ronnie told me that if I got involved, it would just make things worse. I sat by him on the bus, and we were both silent the whole way home. I didn't even try to make a comment because I knew that it wouldn't matter. The rest of that evening remains a huge painted blur in my memory. I knew that it was bad, but again, I guess part of my brain wouldn't let me believe that it was as bad as it was. I did mention it to my mom. I struggled to get the words out, but I told her that I thought Ronnie was in trouble, that he'd gotten an F, and that he was terrified that his father was going to kill him. She talked to me about the situation, but ultimately there wasn't much that we could do. She could call the cops and have them check on him, but then what? That'd probably make it worse for Ronnie, and his dad may actually kill him. I could go over and try to see if he was okay, but Ronnie had specifically said that he was worried that that would make his dad angrier. Eventually, we both settled on me calling after dinner to check on him, and that I would make some excuse about not remembering what homework was due or something. Something believable that wouldn't be likely to raise any alarms. But even with that, I was still worried that his dad would freak out on him. But I never got to make that call. Around 6 p.m., while we were eating dinner, we heard sirens racing down the street. Then more sirens. Then more. My mind immediately went to Ronnie, and I thought that his dad had actually done it. That the cops were going to arrest his father for murdering his only son. That's not quite how things went down, though. Most of the details are still unknown to me, but here's what I know happened. Ronnie went home to face his father, to try and explain the situation, and to try to tell him that it was a mistake like Mr. Henson had said. I guess he figured that things were going to be bad either way, so maybe he could do what another adult had recommended and it could work. Well, it didn't. By the time Ronnie got home, his dad was already a few knuckles deep, and was already at that point that he was agitated. Ronnie tried to avoid him, but at some point he had gone through Ronnie's backpack, found the report, and lost it. This wasn't the first time he had physically assaulted Ronnie, but it was the most violent he had ever been. The injuries that Ronnie ended up with were pretty intense, including several broken bones, and he was going to need to go to the hospital with how badly he'd been beaten, which then set his father off even more, and it escalated to the point that Ronnie said he honestly thought he was going to die. In the heat of everything that was happening, the other victim of Ronnie's father, his mother, had hit a point of no return. She watched her husband beat her son several times, at this point until he was bloodied and beaten, and she knew that she had to do something. It was at this point that she made a decision that was desperate, but she knew that if she didn't do it, Ronnie wasn't going to make it. She grabbed the handgun that Ronnie had kept hidden in the bedroom, ran back into the living room, and she pulled the trigger. She ended up shooting him until there was nothing left in the gun, including several shots after he was lying on the ground. I stepped outside from the table, and I watched the police cars, fire rescue, and ambulances pull up as quickly as they could to the house. There was so much chaos in those moments that night. I watched as the door to the house that I never visited opened up, and the paramedics rushed the stretcher with Ronnie on it into the back of the ambulance. I watched his mother get brought out in cuffs, and watched as the officers blocked the entrance and yard with crime scene tape. Obviously, all of the neighbors saw the aftermath, and there was a lot of confusion and turmoil. My mind was just on Ronnie, and whether or not he was going to get through it. By the end of everything, Ronnie's home life was laid bare for all to see. The information about the abuse, his father's drinking, all of it was thrown out for the nosy vultures to eat up. Ronnie was placed in the care of his aunt while his mother went through the legal proceedings. In the end, somehow, his mother was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense and the protection of her child, despite the fact that she pulled the trigger more times than was necessary. I do not personally blame her for doing that. It's just the one detail that could have easily landed her in prison for the rest of her life. A few months later, Ronnie and his aunt came over to our house for a while so that Ronnie and I could hang out. It was nice to see him, but the trauma of that night had changed him. He was withdrawn, an absolute shadow of the kid that he once was. He was still my best friend, and I loved him as much as a best friend could, but he wasn't himself anymore, and I didn't blame him for that either. Years have passed since this all happened, but the lessons that it taught me remain. I learned about the masks that people wear, hiding their pain and fear behind a facade of normalcy. I learned about how resilient that kid down the street can be, how he could be an absolute genius and a great friend in spite of the fact that his home life was traumatic. I wish that I could have done more for him, but back then, I had no idea what I was supposed to do other than just be there for him if he needed me. What ended up happening was, unfortunately, an event that was more or less written in stone. Someone in that family was bound to end up dead because of his father's abuse, and in this case, it just happened to be the abuser himself. Ronnie ended up moving out of state, and I haven't spoken to him in almost a decade. I hope that he found peace, and I hope that he knows, despite everything, he was never alone. Our friendship, though forever altered by that night, formed the best days of my life, and I would welcome him back into my life in a heartbeat. So that, my friends, was a collection of 3 truly disturbing stories. Stories that were just bone-chilling, just absolutely terrifying, to be honest with you. All 3 of these stories obviously had a very deep theme, not really theme, but you know what I mean, like a deep sense to them. They were all very just disturbing stories. I think that's really the only way I can describe them. And yeah, thank you to everyone who submitted their stories to me, which is all 3 of these at this point for this video. And yeah, hopefully you listeners did enjoy the stories as much as one can pull enjoyment from stories like this. And yeah, if you did, please do hit the thumbs up button, as it does help. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, consider subscribing. And if you feel so bold, can leave me a comment down below this video and letting me know anything. How you're doing, your thoughts, if you have a story like this. Of course, if you have a story, please do consider sending it my way at astheravendreams.com. There's a big button to click to send me your stories. If you have any stories that are paranormal, cryptids, hospital, restaurant, past life, in the woods, middle of nowhere, that kind of stuff, I'm really looking for those for next month. So if you have anything like that, please consider sending it my way. I would genuinely appreciate it. It makes my life easier. I don't have to go find stories. So, a lot of my content is supplied by you lovely people, but not all of it. Quite a bit of it still comes from places like Reddit, Facebook, and other places where stories are posted. And, yeah. If you're feeling generous, you can also join Patreon or memberships to get early access to content like this. And you can do a super thanks to the channel, which is a tip, just basically supporting the channel further. None of that's ever expected, but always appreciated. Yeah. Well, that's it, friends. I hope you're having a beautiful week so far. Hope I do see you again here very soon. But until then, remember, you are loved. You are valid. You are important. You're the best you that you can be. Do not forget it, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And until next time, my friends, much love, and sleep well.